Good morning. Welcome to Today. We made it to Friday.
This was Savannah Guthrie's perky last appearance on the Today Show, 2 days before the unimaginable tragedy of her mother's kidnapping.
3 months, 93 days of silence, dead ends, and a reward that climbed past $1.2 million and stayed there. Unclaimed. Untouched. As if the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie is sitting behind a wall that no amount of money can move. No arrest. No body. No explanation that holds together from beginning to end. Over 30,000 tips reviewed by investigators, and the case, by every visible measure, has stalled. Think about that number for a moment. 30,000 tips. And still nothing. That is not a cold case. That is something else entirely. That is a case where the answer exists, where it is documented somewhere, where someone already holds a piece of it without fully understanding what they are holding. And for 3 months, that piece has stayed exactly where it is. Waiting. Nancy Guthrie was 72 years old. She lived quietly in Tucson, Arizona. She was not a public figure. She did not court attention. She attended church. She kept to herself. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of person this kind of thing is not supposed to happen to. On the night of January 31st, she left a family dinner and went home. Her phone was still inside the house the next morning. Her belongings were untouched. She never made it to church. And somewhere in the hours between those two moments, someone entered her home with a plan that had been building for far longer than a single night. That part, investigators have believed from the beginning. The plan was real. The preparation was real. The man captured on Nancy's security camera moved with measured, deliberate control. Backpack. Gloves. Calm. The kind of calm that does not come from impulse. It comes from rehearsal. What investigators believed they were dealing with was a financial crime. A calculated abduction built around cryptocurrency, around ransom demands with deadlines, around a family wealthy enough to pay and desperate enough to try. The Bitcoin wallet. The anonymous emails. The escalating pressure. Everything pointed in the same direction. Money. And then came April 30th.
I can't help but think that the only thing that I keep coming back to is somehow this involves Savannah Guthrie, the TV personality, but something to do with her profession, something to do with someone who she's been in touch with over the years.
Two of the most experienced criminal profilers in FBI history sat down and said something that did not simply add a new angle to this case. What they said dismantled the theory that had been driving it from the beginning. Quietly. Completely. Without hesitation. Hi viewers. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for over 3 months now, and investigators say the case has completely stalled. Here is the question. Do you believe the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance is still in the Tucson area, yes or no? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because what those two profilers revealed on April 30th was not a new lead. It was a correction. A fundamental shift in the entire direction of the investigation. And once you hear it, the way you have been thinking about this case will never be the same. The profilers were James Fitzgerald and Raymond Carr. Both retired from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Both men who spent their careers not chasing criminals after the fact, but studying how violent offenders think, plan, and act before anyone else recognizes the danger. They are not commentators. They are not theorists. They are the people law enforcement calls when a case stops making sense. And this case had stopped making sense. Here is what they said. The working assumption, the financial motive, the Bitcoin ransom, the calculated execution caught on camera, all of it was built on a foundation that was never solid to begin with. Because according to Fitzgerald and Carr, the person responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie was never focused on Nancy Guthrie. They were focused on her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, the face millions of Americans wake up to every morning. The anchor of NBC's Today Show, one of the most recognized women in American television. She was not peripheral to this crime. She was not simply connected to it through grief and proximity. According to two former FBI profilers with decades of documented behavioral science behind them, Savannah Guthrie was the target all along. Nancy was simply the door that could be opened.
Savannah would not only be dealing with the emotional strain of setting aside her grief to co-host the show, she is aware that her mother's appearances on the show might have made Nancy a target.
And before any profiler said it publicly, before any investigator confirmed it, before any camera crew or crime reporter named it out loud, Savannah said it herself. Sitting across from her colleague Hoda Kotb in her first interview after her mother's disappearance, voice barely holding, she said the thing no one wanted to hear. That it was too much to bear to think that she had brought this to her mother's doorstep. That it happened because of her. That was not just a daughter's grief speaking. That was the most accurate public statement made about this entire case. 3 months ago, the investigation started with a financial theory and 30,000 tips. On April 30th, it found something far more precise, far more personal, and far more dangerous to whoever is still out there holding the silence together. The window on this case is not closed. The profilers are certain of that. And what they outlined on April 30th is not speculation. It is behavioral science applied to a case that has confused everyone who approached it with conventional thinking. Stay with this, because what comes next changes everything you thought you knew about why Nancy Guthrie's door opened that night. And more importantly, it changes everything about who was standing on the other side of it. James Fitzgerald did not arrive at behavioral profiling from a textbook. He built the framework from the inside. During his years at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Fitzgerald and his colleagues did something that had never been done before at that scale. They went directly to the source. They sat across from convicted offenders, people already behind bars with no future left to protect, and they asked them everything. Not casually, not informally, with a structured protocol that eventually grew to 840 documented questions applied to every single crime each offender had committed. Every detail, every decision, every moment where the plan shifted or held. The goal was not punishment. The goal was understanding, because understanding is the only thing that stops the next one. Fitzgerald understood something that most people outside law enforcement never fully grasp. Violent behavior does not erupt from nowhere. It builds. It follows a sequence. And if you know what to look for, the sequence leaves marks long before it becomes dangerous. That is the foundation of behavioral profiling. Not intuition. Not guesswork. Pattern recognition built on thousands of hours of direct documented study. Raymond Carr, his colleague, brought the same framework to the assessment of this case. And together, what they described when they sat down on April 30th was not a theory assembled from public information alone. It was a behavioral red built on decades of experience with exactly this type of progression. This type. That word matters. Because for all the ways this case has felt unprecedented, Fitzgerald and Carr recognized the shape of it. Not the specific details. The shape. The architecture of how it was constructed and why. And the shape told them something immediately. This was never a financially motivated crime. Here is why that conclusion is so significant. From the first days after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the public conversation was organized around money. The Bitcoin wallet. The ransom demands. The deadlines that came and went without resolution. The profile of the suspect on camera, calm, prepared, carrying a backpack and wearing gloves, looked like someone who had built a plan around an outcome. And the assumed outcome was a transaction. A number. A payment that would end this. That assumption shaped everything. The tips that came in. The directions investigators pursued. The public's understanding of who they were looking for and why. But Fitzgerald and Carr looked at the same evidence and saw something different. They saw a behavioral profile that did not match financial motivation. Not in its structure. Not in its execution. Not in the emotional signature it left behind. Financially motivated abductions follow a specific logic. They are transactional by design. The person responsible needs communication. They need a channel. They need the family to receive instructions, to understand the terms, to have a... And right now, that timeline may be the most important piece of evidence in this entire investigation.
Now, a very different Savannah is on the nation's TVs, her face etched with anguish and exhaustion.
Every long night has been agony.
More important than the Bitcoin trail. More important than the 30,000 tips. More important than the surveillance footage of a man moving through a doorway with practiced calm. The behavioral framework is built. The direction is set. But before the investigation can fully follow it, one more layer of the original theory has to be dismantled completely. The ransom was never real. And the proof of that was sitting in plain sight from the very first night. There was no note left at Nancy Guthrie's home on January 31st. That single fact, set against everything that was assumed about this crime, changes the entire picture. If the goal was financial, if someone entered that home intending to collect a ransom, the first communication happens at the scene. That is not optional. That is how the transaction begins. That is how the family understands what is being demanded and what compliance looks like. Without that initial communication, there is no mechanism. There is no crime that functions the way a financially motivated abduction is supposed to function. The notes that appeared afterward were real. But according to James Fitzgerald, they did not come from whoever was responsible for taking Nancy. They came from opportunists. People who saw a high-profile disappearance attached to one of the most recognizable names in American television and inserted themselves into the chaos. People who already had access to anonymous email infrastructure and a Bitcoin wallet and saw a window where someone else's tragedy might become their advantage. That is a specific and documented pattern in high-profile cases. When a disappearance generates national coverage, when a family is known to have resources, certain individuals will attempt to exploit the situation. Not because they know anything, because they know how to appear as though they do. The FBI invested significant time and resources attempting to trace the email account used in those communications. They could not do it. The family believed they had found a pathway to trace the Bitcoin address attached to the ransom demands. That pathway closed. Harvey Levin, reporting on this directly, confirmed that the trail went cold. The wallet was visible. Deposits could be seen. But who received the funds on the other end was, by design, virtually impossible to determine. That is precisely why that particular currency was chosen. Not by the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance. By the people who saw an opportunity and took it. Think about what the failed digital trail actually reveals. Whoever sent those notes understood how to move anonymously online. That is not impulsive behavior. That is not someone acting in the moment with whatever was available. That is a person who had prepared, who thought about what came after the crime, not just the crime itself, and who built a layer of misdirection designed to redirect investigative attention toward a financial explanation that would never resolve. It worked. For 3 months, it worked. The Bitcoin angle consumed resources. It consumed attention. It consumed the investigative bandwidth that should have been directed somewhere else entirely from the beginning. And while the trail ran cold in a digital wallet, the behavioral trail, the one Fitzgerald and Carr were describing, sat waiting. Here's the pivot that changes everything. If this was never about money, then the driving force behind it was something that cannot be transferred, cannot be negotiated, cannot be satisfied with a payment and a deadline. The driving force was psychological, emotional, rooted in a fixation that had been building for years toward a specific person who remained, by every practical measure, out of reach. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most visible women in America. She appears on national television every morning. She is surrounded by security infrastructure, by colleagues, by the institutional protection that comes with being a major network personality. She is accessible as a public image and completely inaccessible as a private individual. But her mother was different. Nancy Guthrie lived quietly in Tucson. She was private. She was not protected by institutional security. She existed at the edge of Savannah's public world, close enough to matter, separate enough to reach. And Savannah knew it before anyone confirmed it publicly. Sitting across from Hoda Kotb, voice carrying the weight of something she had already worked through in private, she said it plainly. That it was too much to bear to think she had brought this to her mother's doorstep. That it might have happened because of her. She was not speculating. She was processing something she already understood at a level that no press statement could contain.
Just last November, Savannah was given a hero's reception in her hometown and appeared with her mother in her favorite restaurant.
Cheers.
Two former FBI profilers with decades of documented behavioral science behind them confirmed publicly what Savannah had already named privately. This was never about Nancy. Nancy was the point of access, the door that could be opened when the one that mattered could not be. That shifts the entire investigation, not toward a financial network or a criminal enterprise, toward a specific individual, a specific pattern of behavior, a specific record of contact that almost certainly exists somewhere in the documented correspondence surrounding Savannah Guthrie's public life. And that is exactly where Fitzgerald and Carr directed investigators to look. The profile that emerged from the April 30th assessment is precise. This is not a career criminal moving through a pattern of opportunistic offenses. The behavioral signature does not match that framework at all. What it matches is a fixation-based offender. Someone whose primary driver is psychological rather than financial. Someone whose relationship to the target, even if entirely one-sided and entirely internal, feels real and significant and consuming to them. These individuals do not operate on impulse. They operate on obsession. And obsession, by its nature, is patient. Raymond Carr described the profile clearly. Local to the Tucson area. Specific knowledge of Nancy's home, her routine, her schedule. That kind of knowledge does not come from a single search or a brief period of attention. It comes from sustained, deliberate study of Savannah's public life, conducted over enough time to locate the private world underneath it. Her mother's location, her living situation, the rhythms of her daily existence. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller stated directly that the person responsible is most likely someone with specific knowledge of the Tucson area and Nancy's living conditions. Local, knowledgeable, patient. And here is the detail that the profilers added that almost no one has given sufficient weight. The man visible on Nancy's security camera that night, the one who moved with such measured, deliberate control, is likely not the person who built this plan. Clemente and Fitzgerald assessed his behavior and found inconsistencies. Small ones. Edges in the precision that suggest someone executing instructions rather than someone operating from a position of full authorship. The calm is genuine, but the control has limits that point toward a person who is following steps already laid out, not someone who designed the steps themselves. Which means there is a second layer. Someone who planned this. Someone who identified the target, studied the environment, mapped the access points, and put the entire sequence in motion. Someone who may have thought carefully